Welcome to Praise, Prayer and Preaching with the Rev Dr Rick Dacey, Senior Minister, Wesley Congregational Life.
So tonight we are beginning a 5-part series entitled, Unless the Lord Builds the House, Growing a Mission-Driven Church. Psalm 127 reads, Unless the Lord builds the house, the builders labor in vain. You know, it's got a pithy proverbial quality that makes it an almost irresistible sermon title for preachers. And so it more often than not, this verse is used as a launching point for capital campaigns, building programs, building projects. That's not what we're about in this series. Because while that is a fair view of the psalm in Solomon's context, the overall theme of Psalm 127 has a broader and deeper implication. Without God, none of our human efforts, none of our human achievements and accomplishments are worth anything, really. And it's in that broader, deeper context of the theme that's what we're going to explore from different angles over these 5 weeks. We'll be talking about the growth of the church. Now, it's important for us to remember that there are different ways to grow a church. There are a lot of different ways to grow the church, but I want to look, just for a moment, I want to look at 2 different ways. One way to grow a church is through manufactured growth. All right? This is the easy way to grow a church, through manufactured growth. Manufactured growth follows formulas. It's very easy, very simple. It's just a matter of providing the right church product at the right time for the right target market, preferably prefabricated Christians who know how to do church, in a way that consumers want to consume it. And if you get it right, you know, I'm no genius, but I could give you a formula for filling this theater every week within a year. I don't say that as a boast. It's actually pretty easy if you get the formula right. If you invest in the right places, we could fill this theater every week. Fast and easy. In contrast, there is the hard way of growth. Discipleship. Discipleship growth is very different than manufactured growth. Discipleship growth, first of all, is not something that we can control. If manufactured growth follows formulas, discipleship growth follows Jesus. Discipleship growth doesn't happen overnight or even in the matter of months. It took years for Jesus himself to form and shape the disciples who spent 24 hours a day with him. To build them in relationship, to form them and shape them in community with one another. It took years. Whereas manufactured growth can be framed in consumer terms. What do I want to get out of church? Christian discipleship is costly, even sacrificial. It's not a spiritual accessory that can fit neatly into your life. It's a whole new life altogether. Discipleship transforms from the inside out. It's not about learning a set of moral guidelines or signing off on a doctrinal statement or adding a spiritual element into your life. Growing a church through growing disciples is the hard way of growth. It takes time, hard time. But it's also the only authentic way to grow a church. And It's worth noting that it's the approach that Jesus took when he began to build the church. In the passage we heard from Matthew 4 tonight, we find Jesus walking into the workplace of Simon Peter and Andrew and James and John. He walks right into their workplace. And that's a striking thing to do. It's a radical thing to do. In both the Greek and Jewish culture of the time, disciples went looking for their master. Disciples chose the master they wanted to attach themselves to. Jesus turns it around. Jesus comes looking for them. He chooses them. He calls them. He calls them, and not only does he call them, but he sends them. He calls them, he sends them while he's calling them. Come follow me, Jesus said, and I will send you out to fish for people. So right here at the very beginning, where Jesus comes to them, he meets them where they are. He doesn't wait for them to come to him. And then he promises to send them out right here at the very beginning of his ministry. He sets the pattern for a missional church right at the outset. Jesus is missional. And Jesus calls us to be missional. But this is the problem. This is the problem with building a church through discipleship growth, with growing in that way. Discipleship growth requires following Christ. And we have a hard time. We have a hard time with following. We have a hard time. I know it's all we like sheep have gone astray. We've gone each our own way. And from the time we're toddlers, we want to do things our own way, don't we? We have a hard time accepting that there's a strength or a wisdom beyond our own. And we have a really, really hard time depending on that strength and wisdom beyond our own. You ever find yourself in that situation? Churches find themselves in that situation all the time. All the time. Because most of the time, people who lead churches, the ministers and the lay leaders, they're people who've been around church a long time. They pretty much know how church works. They have a pretty good idea of how to do church. And they've been around church a while, and they know how to form a committee. They know how to run a program. They know how to lead a study. They know how to plan a worship service. If you've been part of church for a long time, it's tempting to think, I can figure this out. I can just get on with this. And so you do. You get on with it. You get stuck into it. And inevitably, at some point in the project, churches find themselves stuck. Stuck in old habits, in old forms. Stuck in inflexible patterns. Stuck trying to replay or revisit or replicate past glory. Stuck trying to do things because, well, it's just stuff that churches do. Stuck. Because that's the way we've always done it. And churches often find that while busy church activity leads to results, they're not always good results. Busy church activity can burn through good people without making disciples, without building up the community of the church. That's not a good result. Busy church activity can cause a community to turn inward to focus on the ridiculously petty, the color of the carpet, the order of the service, all sorts of different petty little things and church politics and can get so tangled and bound up. We can get stuck when we go it alone. We can have bad results. We can find ourselves neglecting the equipping of the saints for the work of ministry. Now, of course, it's not just church leaders. Well, I want to blame church leaders, but it's not just church leaders who fall into the let's just get on with it trap. There are also generally people in every church who know exactly what the church ought to be doing. And they take every opportunity to vocalize this. Every church has these people. Every church I've ever encountered has people who say, well, the church ought to be doing this, or the church ought to be doing that. Funny thing about these people is that they don't understand that they are the church. See, they see the church as some sort of external institution that doesn't include them. The church ought to do this, or the church ought to do that, and by that they often mean, well, the church leaders, the ministers, the pastors, the elders, the worship leaders, the active volunteers. It's not we, the church, ought to do this. They, the church, ought to do this. And when they say that the church ought to do this or that, they really mean that someone else ought to take care of this. And these vocal spectators that every church has, they put added pressure on lay leaders and on ministers, not only to do things, not only to be busy in activity, but to be seen to be doing things, which in turn just puts more pressure on church leaders to get on with what they know, forming committees and running programs and leading studies and planning worship and doing all of these things the way we've always done them. And here's the thing. Here's the kicker. We can do all of these things. We can do all of these things. We can generate lots of busy activity, and we can do all of it without following the Lord's leading. We can do all of it without following his guidance and direction, without relying on his inspiration, without depending on his strength, without trusting in his wisdom. We can do all of it by leaning on our own understanding. We just shouldn't be too surprised that if we lean on our own understanding and we find that our churches kind of reflect that. Unless the Lord builds the house, those builders labor in vain. If anyone could have done Christianity solo, if anyone could have done Christianity on his own, for his own sake, in his own way, it would have been Jesus. It's interesting that he doesn't. Maybe that should tell us something. The fact that he doesn't do it on his own should tell us something. The fact that he goes to Capernaum in accordance with the scriptures should tell us something. The fact that he calls a community around him, he calls disciples around him, should tell us something. He calls Simon Peter and Andrew and James and John, and they leave their boats and they drop their nets to follow him. He leads them. You ever wonder what would happen if they didn't drop their nets? If they held on to those nets? You ever wonder what would happen if those disciples said, No. What would have happened if those disciples, in their fear, had clutched on to their nets, the life that they had always known? What would happen? Think about the fear that must have gripped them at this call. Think about it. Jesus wasn't asking them to be on a committee. Jesus wasn't asking them to take their turn on a roster. He was asking them to surrender the whole of their lives to follow wherever he would lead. Think about that fear. The fear of trusting their future to him. Imagine the way their hearts must have raced. Imagine their fear, the fear of the unknown. Fear of rejection, fear of isolation, fear of shame and humiliation and pain, fear of failure, of falling down, of making a mistake, of taking a wrong turn. Fear of loss of people, loss of direction, loss of things, loss of control, loss even of life itself. Think about the fear. What would have happened if they had said no to Jesus? What would have happened if they had been held back and bound up by their nets of fear? The church throughout the world, throughout the developed world today, is in the midst of a frightening time. You know, the Uniting Church in Australia has declined by 40% since 1991. 40%. As dramatic as that may sound, it's the rule, not the exception. For decades, churches across Europe and Australia and North America have been bound up by their nets of fear, trying to hold on to what used to be. And it seems like it's all gone pear-shaped for the church in the West. Year after year, decade after decade, we've seen our numbers decline, our resources diminish, our place in society pushed to the margins across many denominations. A general malaise has taken hold, a sense of inevitable loss, and a belief that our best days are behind us. You know, some churches are growing, to be sure, but many of them are growing as lifeboat churches. Without making a whole lot of new disciples, their growth is coming from taking on survivors of churches that are going under. It's a frightening time for the church in the developed world. And for us who love the church, this decline across the church is scary to face, which is why I think we go to such extraordinary lengths to avoid facing it. And we don't like to be confronted with it. It's like the bear. What would you do if you went for a walk in the woods in North America and you came across this? What would you do? Experts in bear behavior tell us exactly what you should do. Experts in bear behavior tell us that we can't outrun the bear. A bear is very fast, faster than you. And if you run, all you're going to do is trigger its predator-prey instincts. No, you can't outrun a bear, and you can't outclimb a bear. Bears are excellent climbers. And when that bear does catch you, well, you don't need an expert in bear behavior to tell you what will happen then. No, if you're unarmed and you come across a bear in the wild, really the only chance that you have, say bear behavior experts, is this. Don't run. Turn and face it. Look it square in the eye. Author Bill Bryson was given this advice before he set out to hike the Appalachian Trail, and he called it the least likely to be followed piece of advice he had ever received. And I have to agree. I mean, can you imagine facing down this fellow? I can't. My reason might tell me I can't outrun the bear, but my legs would be doing their very best to prove my reason wrong. No, our reason tells us that we need to turn and face this, church. But the impulse to run, to excuse, to blame is overwhelming. You know, one way we avoid facing our fears is by adopting the hiker and the bears, the hikers and the bear mentality, the hikers and the bear mentality. You know the deal with the hikers and the bear, of course. A bear comes charging at you and your fellow hikers, and you don't need to outrun the bear. You just need to outrun your fellow hikers. And churches, all too often, adopt this same mentality. They adopt this same mentality rather than face their fears. They look at smaller churches, slower churches, and they see them getting gobbled up. And they shake their head. It's a shame for them. How sad for them. But we'll be right. We'll be right. That bear won't get to us because we're stronger, we're faster than those other churches. Comforting, though that thought may be. The problem with the hikers and the bear mentality is twofold. First of all, it's incredibly selfish, and it runs counter to that call to mutual support that congregations have, and it's so clear in the New Testament. But the other problem, a very practical problem with the bear and the hiker's mentality is that ultimately it is self-defeating. Because that bear's appetite is insatiable. It's been eating for decades. And it's not going to stop with those smaller, slower churches. At some point in the not too distant future, it's going to eat its way through them all, and it's going to get to churches like ours, like Wesley Mission. But here's the good news. Here's the good news. It doesn't have to be that way. It doesn't have to be that way. We can stop running right now. We can turn and face the things that we fear head on. Look it square in the eye. We can refuse to accept a narrative of increasing fracture and inevitable decline. We can dare to claim a future in Christ as bold and as faithful as what we have left in the past. But to do that, we need to be ready to drop our nets. A church in decline is a church gripped and governed by fear, holding on to control, trying to grasp onto the status quo. In contrast, a mission-driven church is a church that centers its life in the calling and sending of Jesus Christ. It focuses its activities on following the Lord's calling and sending wherever He leads. Like those first disciples, we need to be willing to let go of our nets, to let go of our fears, to follow and trust. A mission-driven church is a church that recognizes that it's not my church. It's not my church. The church doesn't belong to me. I belong to the church, and the church belongs to the Lord. A mission-driven church is a church that is prepared to go wherever Christ calls us, wherever Christ leads and sends us, to connect our lives with the people that He leads us to. A mission-driven church does not exist for its own sake, but for Christ's sake. And over the course of these 5 weeks, we're going to look at what it means to grow a church in every way as a mission-driven church, not only in numbers, but in spiritual depth, in impact, in reach, in care and compassion, in community, and in unity. Now, I believe that the renewal and the revival of the church, not only here in Sydney, but in Australia and beyond Australia can begin right here among us. Not because of our plans, not because of our schemes, but by the power at work within us. God has a way if we're ready to give him our will. And I believe that if we turn and face the bear today, there will be many other churches that we will find standing alongside us. And more important, we will be standing with Christ. My sisters and brothers, hear the good news. Christ is calling us to drop our nets, to drop the nets of our fears that we clutch onto, and to step out in freedom. To step out in freedom from all that has held us back and bound us up. That's not to say that we won't fear. We will. We will fear. Like every other human being, we will fear, but if we put our whole trust in the Lord, then our fears will no longer govern us, will no longer drive us. They will no longer have power over us. In Christ, we drop the nets of our fears and we leave them on the beach. And our fear of the unknown cannot bind us because we put our trust in Christ who knows all and who knows us all. Our fear of rejection and isolation cannot bind us because we put our trust in Christ who refuses to leave us alone. Our fear of shame and humiliation and pain cannot bind us because we put our trust in Christ who has taken all of these things upon himself. Our fear of failure, of taking the wrong turn cannot bind us because we put our trust in Christ who calls us again and again and again, follow me. Our fear of loss of people, loss of things, loss of control, loss of life cannot bind us because we put our trust in Christ, the conqueror of sin and death, and our Redeemer. Sisters and brothers in Christ, the one who calls us to follow is the one who gives us the strength and the hope and the grace to follow. What response will we give him tonight? Are we ready to drop our nets?